you attend, you can be a part of that. We're also going to have a basket if you want to leave them a note or give them anything like that, just to honor them in that way. So don't miss it this Sunday. And since they're here, I wanted to honor it, and they're here with their little precious girls. So thank y'all. With that, I think a pastor's already here. He came early today. I don't know. Just felt like it, I guess. Y'all know he rolls in right on time. So I would love to pray for us before he gets up here and just ask God to bless our time and our meatloaf, and we'll go from there. So if you wouldn't mind, let's pause and pray. Lord God, we're grateful just to be together, to gather, and Lord, we're thankful for Warren and the crew and this meal they've provided for us. Grateful for their faithful service week in and week out. And Lord, I pray as we continue to walk through Exodus, it's such a rich story of your life with your people, and one that's still very relevant to us today. And so as we open it, as we study it, as Dr. Wiles has prepped and is leading us, I pray that you illuminate the scriptures for us, that you teach us something new about life with you, and that you help us to be your people in this day and age. And so, Lord, we're grateful for all these things, and we just ask you to bless us today. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank y'all.
Well, all right, everybody, welcome to our Bible study today. I hope you're doing well. I want to welcome those of you that are here in this room and those of you that are joining us online. We are glad you've chosen to spend this time with us in the middle of the week. And, today we're going to actually finally get to the Exodus. That's what this book is about. And so we're finally going to arrive there today. Here's what I want to do. Chapters 11 through 14 tell several stories. So we're going to try to take them one at a time. One of the stories, chapter 11 through 14 tells, is the final plague. And then it also tells the story of the actual Exodus. Then it tells the story of the Passover with the instructions and helping Israel understand the meaning of the Passover. So we're not going to get all of that done today. So we're going to take them one at a time. We'll get the plagues and the Exodus done today. But if you think about what's happening in Israel's life when this was written, we're probably at the end of close to the end of the wilderness experience by the time Moses actually collects all this and puts it together. So we're probably 35 years or so maybe removed from the Exodus. Does that make sense? In other words, Moses has had time to reflect on this story. He's been leading the children of Israel as they've been led by the Spirit of God through the wilderness. And so we're probably more than 3 decades past when all this actually happened. And so Moses feels, evidently, under the leadership of the Spirit, the responsibility to make sure that Israel understands what happened, why it happened, and what they are supposed to do from now on because it happened. Because we don't know if there's enough evidence to help us understand if they actually practiced the Passover in the wilderness. So, in other words, Moses is going to have to make sure these people understand the story, what it meant, and how they were supposed to respond to it. Okay? So with that said, let's just look at the outline. We'll start with, I just put there for you, the Exodus. So Exodus 11. Y'all remember when last week, we get to the end of Exodus 10, and Pharaoh said, "Don't come back and see me anymore. If you do, you will die." Moses said, "Okay, I won't ever come back again." We left the cliffhanger because Moses hadn't responded yet. Here's his response to that before he leaves. So this is his final message to Pharaoh. And what's happened is the Lord has revealed to Moses the details of the last plague, which is going to be the death of the firstborn. So chapter 11 in some ways serves as a bridge representing Moses' last communication with Pharaoh before this final plague. And what God basically tells Moses is, I'm going to accomplish my plan. Eventually, Pharaoh is going to set you all free. However, Pharaoh is going to remain unconvinced even after you tell him what's about to happen. Okay? So that's kind of where we are in this story. So let's just look at chapter 11. So Moses says, I'm not going to come back again. Then you have this little interlude in the text. Now the Lord had said to Moses, so Moses is recalling this, I will bring one more plague on Pharaoh and on Egypt, one more strike, one more blow is what that word means. After that, he will let you go from here. So this is the first time Moses has heard this. You know, after this one, you're going, okay? And when he does, he'll drive you out completely. Tell the people that men and women alike are to ask their neighbors for articles of silver and gold. The Lord made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, and Moses himself was highly regarded in Egypt by Pharaoh's officials and by the people. So Moses said, this is his final warning. This is what the Lord says. About midnight, I'll go throughout Egypt. Every firstborn son in Egypt will die, from the firstborn son of Pharaoh who sits on the throne to the firstborn son of the female slave who's at her handmill. and all the firstborn of the cattle as well. There will be loud wailing throughout Egypt, worse than there has ever been or ever will be again. But among the Israelites, not a dog will bark at any person or animal. Then you will know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. All these officials of yours will come to me, bowing down before me, saying, Go, you and all the people who follow you, and after that I will leave. So that's Moses' last word. And then it's interesting, and again, if you think Moses is the author, which most of us believe that, Moses says, Then Moses, hot with anger, left Pharaoh. So Moses is writing this about himself. He was upset with Pharaoh for many reasons. Why had Pharaoh made it come to this? Why had Pharaoh been so hard from the very beginning? How many Jewish boys had Pharaoh's family killed? Well, we don't know. We just know that, remember, they were sacrificed in the Nile River. So Moses finishes his comments. Look at verse 9. The Lord had said to Moses, Pharaoh will refuse to listen to you so that my wonders may be multiplied in Egypt. Moses and Aaron performed all these wonders before Pharaoh, but the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. That's the first 9 plagues, and he wouldn't let the Israelites go out of the country. So it's a summary, really. Okay, hello. Hope we're all okay. Lori, y'all okay? Okay, all right. You're still standing, okay. Pharaoh is still not going to relent. He still remains unconvinced. And you know, it's hard, y'all, I think for us to reconcile some of this, but Pharaoh saw himself as a god. And he knew nothing about Israel's God. He trusted in his own gods and goddesses. He saw himself as a child of the sun god. So he had this view of himself and trusted his word, trusted what he said, trusted his perspective, trusted his sages. And so he still, after all this has happened, he still remains unconvinced. So with that said, here's the plan that's going to unfold, okay? If you look at verse 4 of chapter 11, here's what the Lord said through Moses to Pharaoh. About midnight, every firstborn son in Egypt is going to die. This is the final plague. It's interesting how Moses puts it in verse 7. He says, with the Israelites, the dogs aren't even going to bark. That means nobody is going to be invading the land of Goshen. It's going to be so quiet, the dogs aren't even barking. You, however, are going to be in a place where there's going to be wailing, and parents are going to be wailing, and siblings will be wailing. The Israelites will be able to sleep. Their dogs won't be barking. So contrasting what's about to happen to Israel in contrast to Egypt. So what is it that God is doing? Well, if you look at chapter 12, verse 12, here's what the plan really includes. On that same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. And so what is God doing? We've talked about this several times. I mentioned it Sunday morning again. God is dismantling the Egyptian worldview right in front of the eyes of both the Egyptians and the Israelis. He's letting the Israelites know all these gods here are false gods. Are there spiritual forces of darkness at work in Egypt? Well, of course. They've got sorcerers, they've got magicians. Are there forces of darkness at work in our world? Well, of course. There always are. That was true in those days. Pharaoh represented some of that. His magicians, his sorcerers, they were all given to some of that. And so they had a certain worldview that was built around this pantheon of gods and goddesses, and God is just overwhelming them. And he is defeating them, and that's exactly what he says in chapter 12, verse 12. I'm bringing judgment not just on the Egyptians, but I'm bringing it on all the gods of Egypt. Now, remember I said Sunday morning, one of the questions that scholars debate is this one. How entrenched were the Israelites in the ways of Egypt? How much of the worldview had infiltrated the Israelites? In other words, had they adopted some of the pagan practices? How pure was their faith? The problem is we don't really know necessarily, but here's what we do know, as I mentioned Sunday morning, it didn't take them long in the wilderness to build a golden calf and make sacrifices to it. So where did they learn that? Well, they learned that in Egypt because the calf was sacred in Egypt. And so there were gods who were represented by the image of a calf. So these plagues, on the one hand, are defeating the gods of Egypt. God's dismantling the Egyptian worldview, but He's also building a new worldview for Israel if necessary, to where Israel recognizes He's the only true God. These other gods and goddesses are false, and they're nothing compared to Him. So all that's going on. Now, included in this plan, though, is God gave specific instructions to the children of Israel to protect them from what the NIV calls the destroyer. Sometimes we call him the angel of death, the agent of judgment. And so Moses gets these instructions from God about what the Israelites are supposed to do. You see some of that in chapter 12. And then Moses shares those instructions with the children of Israel to make sure that they understand what they're supposed to do. We'll get to that in just a minute. Then, interestingly enough, there's the plunder. It's kind of fascinating to me. If you look at verse 2 of chapter 11. Tell the people that men and women alike are to ask their neighbors for articles of silver and gold. And the Lord made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people. And Moses himself now was highly regarded in Egypt by Pharaoh's officials and by the people. Moses' story and Joseph's story are juxtaposed in these two books. Joseph shows up in Egypt as a slave, a Hebrew slave, and he has to win the favor of everybody who comes in contact with him. And then he eventually finds himself in the court of Pharaoh, right? He eventually ascends to where he's now working for Pharaoh, and he's second in command. Moses is born into that. He's born into a position that Joseph had to earn, if you will, because he was brought into Pharaoh's house by the princes. But then Moses will lose favor. He will return to Egypt himself on his own, and when he returns to Egypt himself, he joins the slaves. So it's kind of a opposite trajectory, if you will, from what Joseph had to what Moses had. But the longer Moses is there, the greater respect he gets. And so finally, even among the Egyptians and the Egyptian officials, the text says Moses had gained their favor. And they also had begun to see Israel favorably. Now again, these are their slaves, so it's quite a fascinating thing. Then, if you'll go to chapter 12, verse 33 of chapter 12, the text says this: the Egyptians urged the people to hurry, this is after the plague, to hurry and leave the country. For otherwise, they said, we're all going to die. So the people took their dough before the yeast was added, carried it on their shoulders in kneading troughs, wrapped in clothing. The Israelites did as Moses instructed and asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and for clothing. Because you think about it, y'all, these are slaves. They have very few possessions. They're not going to be able to provide for themselves. They're about to go to the wilderness. And God has a plan. He's going to be asking them to build him a tent. And it's going to be heavily decorated. Well, these folks have nothing to decorate the tabernacle with. They don't own anything like that. They're slaves. And so they get all this gold and silver from the Egyptians, and they get clothing for them. In verse 36, the Lord had made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, and they gave them what they asked for, so they plundered the Egyptians. Isn't that fascinating? If you had met Moses there at the burning bush and said to Moses, you're going to go back to Egypt. You're going to go before Pharaoh. He's eventually going to set all of Israel free, and you're going to walk out without a fight. And, oh, by the way, you're going to take much of their gold and silver with you. How believable is that? Moses said he's not an army commander. We have no idea what kind of organization Israel had. He was very familiar with Pharaoh's army. You know, my whole life, I've heard about Pharaoh's army at my house. Every time you cook too much food, my daddy would say, have we cooked enough food for Pharaoh's army. How many times have I heard that in my life? I don't know if y'all ever heard that in y'all's house, but that was my daddy's favorite thing to say. So even I heard about Pharaoh's army growing up. And, so you know Moses knows full well who these people are. And look what's about to happen. They're going to walk out of Egypt with all of their livestock and with the Egyptians' goods, and they're going to leave without a fight. It's a fascinating story to me. So they did plunder the Egyptians. But really the story, y'all, of the Exodus is about the power of Yahweh. And so the Lord demonstrated his power through his judgment of the Egyptians and at the same time his miraculous deliverance of Israel. So I just gave you some bullet points. You already know this story, but let's just walk through it real quickly. So Israel, if you look at chapter 12, verse 13. Well, let's go back. Chapter 12, look at verse 7. Once Israel kills, each household kills a lamb. Look at, verse 6. Take care of the lamb until the 14th day of the month, when all the members of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight. Then they're to take some of the blood, put it on the sides and tops of the door frames of the houses where they eat the lambs. Okay? Then if you'll notice verse 13 of chapter 12, the blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. Y'all see that? I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. And so the Lord says, kill a lamb, gives them instructions about it. We'll talk about that next week, about how they're supposed to do it. But the key factor here was to take the blood of the lamb and put it on the door frames of their houses. Now, they're going to receive instructions from Moses. Moses is going to make sure they understand what they're supposed to do. If you look at verse 21, he's getting that information from God. Look at verse 21. Moses summoned all the elders of Israel and said to them, go at once, select the animals for your families, slaughter the Passover lamb, take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood in the basin, and put some of the blood on the top and on the sides of the door frame. None of you shall go out of the door of your house till morning. When the Lord goes through the land to strike down the Egyptians, he will see the blood on the top and sides of the door frame, and he will pass over, there's that word, the doorway, and he will not permit, and the NIV says the destroyer, the death angel, to enter your houses or to strike you down. So there are their instructions to protect the firstborn of their homes. Now, I don't know what the families said to each other about this. We don't have all of that information. You know, we've been watching the Moses documentary on Netflix. Some of y'all have seen it. And anytime that folks produce movies or shows about anything biblical nowadays, people get really jumpy because they put things in there that aren't in the Bible. Right? So, for example, The Chosen. That's been one of the criticisms of The Chosen. Well, and when you read, I've read interviews with Dallas Jenkins, his is a little more dicey because he actually has Jesus in his series, and he has Jesus saying things that aren't necessarily in the Bible. So that's a little dicey, right? It's made some Christians jumpy. I actually like it. I think it's been a great take on the life of Jesus. It's humanized the disciples. I've enjoyed The Chosen. And just come to grips with the fact that I don't know everything Jesus said, and he's trying to make sure that he doesn't have Jesus say anything that's inconsistent with what we know he did say. Does that make sense? That's what he's trying to do. Well, the thing about Moses is the same way. You know, you're talking about one of the most revered men who's ever lived, and his story is very plainly told in the Bible. The Quran also talks about him. So in this new documentary about Moses, you have Quranic folks speaking, you have Jewish folks speaking, you have Christians speaking kind of as part of the documentary. But anyway, as part of the journey, you've got Moses engaged in all this conversation that we're not really sure how it all played out. I have found it quite interesting. Not sure what I think about it yet. I'm not done with it yet. But one of the more fascinating conversations that's in the documentary is the one between Pharaoh and his sister. Because according, in the way the documentary unfolds, when Pharaoh finally realizes Moses is a Hebrew, he goes to her and says, why didn't you tell us that Moses was a Hebrew when you I mean, you brought him into our home. And then she says to him, well, you know that Daddy would have killed him. That's why. And he's like, oh, yeah. Well, I have no idea, but to be honest with you, I hadn't thought much about that. But, somewhere along the way, they had to have a conversation about who Moses was because they all knew him. And now all of a sudden, he's dressed like a Hebrew. He's not dressed like an Egyptian anymore. And that confuses Pharaoh. Why would Moses be dressed like one of them when he's one of us? He had to come to the realization he's one of them, actually. Wonder what happened in everybody's house that night when they killed the lamb and put the blood on the doorpost. I wonder how many firstborn kids went outside to check just to make sure. I mean, not that they didn't trust your dad, but I'm just saying, I'm just thinking, hey, Dad, what was it we were supposed to do tonight? I don't know how that went. We don't have any of that, but some of that's going on. There's fear. The folks don't know what they're going to do. They've never been anywhere. They've lived their whole lives right there as slaves. I mean, they're on the edge of a whole brand new adventure. What's it going to be like? I mean, there had to be a lot of dynamics there. But the point is, God gave them a plan, and what they didn't know was they were actually pointing to something that would be ultimately a much greater fulfillment in the person of Jesus. They had no way of knowing that at this point. But that's really what we're seeing. This story is going to point us to the real Passover lamb who will be slain at Passover for all of us. So it's fascinating how this unfolds. So you get to verse 29, chapter 12. On that fateful night at midnight, the destroyer made his way through Egypt. Look at it. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and the firstborn of all the livestock as well. Pharaoh and all his officials and all the Egyptians got up during the night, and there was loud wailing in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. There's a lot in the Old Testament about firstborn. In fact, God even told Moses Israel is his firstborn. And so there's this connection where God claims the firstborn as his. He will explain that even in the law. And on that night, like I said, who knows how many firstborn children the Pharaoh's family had put to death in the history of Israel. We don't know. But on this night, they lost all of theirs. Then, verse 31, Pharaoh relented from his rebellious actions. He gave Moses and Aaron permission to lead Israel out of Egypt. Look at verse 31. During the night, Pharaoh summoned to Moses and Aaron and said, "Up, lead my people, you and the Israelites. Go and worship the Lord as you've requested. Take your flocks, your herds, as you've said. And isn't it interesting?" He says, "And go and also bless me." What a fascinating exchange. Most powerful man in the world asks these two Hebrew men, "Bless me before you leave." So what an interesting turn of events. And so then Moses gets everybody ready to make sure they're ready to go. And then you come to verse 37, and they leave. So the Israelites journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth. There were about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. Many other people went up with them, and also large droves of livestock, both flocks and herds. With the dough the Israelites had brought from Egypt, they baked loaves of unleavened bread. The dough was without yeast because they'd been driven out of Egypt and did not have time to prepare the food for themselves. Now, the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of the 430 years, to the very day, all the Lord's divisions left Egypt. Because the Lord kept vigil that night to bring them out of Egypt, on this night all the Israelites were to keep vigil to honor the Lord for generations to come. So again, Moses is writing this years later, and he's calling to mind exactly what happened. Look at the little footnote in chapter 13, verse 17. Or really starts in verse 19. Look at verse 17. Chapter 13. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them out on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter. For God said if they faced war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the desert road toward the Red Sea. The Israelites went up out of Egypt ready for battle. Isn't that interesting? Went up ready for battle. 19, chapter 13, verse 19. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him because Joseph had made the Israelites swear an oath. He had said, "God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up with you from this place." So Moses gets the people ready, gives them their instructions. They leave, not really sure what their future is going to be like. They leave in divisions, the text says, whatever that means for us. And they were prepared for battle. They were unsure what they were going to face. But again, this is a brand new experience for them. But notice God did not leave them by themselves. He manifested His guiding presence for Israel via a pillar of cloud by day, a pillar of fire by night. Look at verse 20 of chapter 13. After leaving Succoth, they camped at Etham on the edge of the desert. By day, the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light so they could travel by day or night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. So the Lord, not only did He bring the plagues on Egypt, set them free, He manifested His presence with them. Then you come to a really interesting part of the story, chapter 14. The Lord led Israel eventually to the edge of the Red Sea. And what an interesting way to go. Marching straight to the sea. That's what happened. Look at verse 14. The Lord said to Moses, tell the Israelites, chapter 14 rather, verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, tell the Israelites to turn back and encamp near Pi-hahiroth between Migdol and the sea. They're encamped by the sea, so they kind of made a little circle directly opposite Baal-zephon. Pharaoh will think the Israelites are wandering around in the land in confusion, hemmed in by the desert. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. But I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. So the Israelites did this. So, they're now camped by the Red Sea. Verse 5, the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled. And then notice what happens. Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about them and said, what have we done? We have let all of our Israelites go. It's our workforce for part of our nation. So he said, go get them, basically. So you come to verse 10, and the Israelites are now trapped. You've got Pharaoh's army attacking them from the west, and they're hemmed in by the Red Sea on the east. So I don't know if y'all have ever been in a place in your life where you felt like you were hemmed in. It just happens to us sometimes. And you can feel like you have few options. Well, that's certainly where these people were. Now, verse 11, they had a committee meeting. So they're Baptists a little bit. So after the committee meeting, somebody gave the majority report. Verse 11 said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us out to the desert to die? Now remember, they've just seen the Lord rescue all their children, right? They've just seen God bring the plague on the firstborn. They've just plundered the Egyptians. But this is a challenging time. And they even say to Moses, to him, verse 12, didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone? We're happy being slaves. The best defenders of the status quo are the people who are in charge of the status quo. And they will defend it fiercely. Okay? They said it'd been better for us to serve the Egyptians than die in the desert. So notice Moses' response. It's one of my favorite texts in the book of Exodus. Verse 13, Moses answered the people, do not be afraid. Stand firm and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you'll never see again. And then one of my favorite verses in this entire story, verse 14, the Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. There are sometimes that's what we do. We just have to be still and watch the Lord fight for us. And it turns out, y'all, He's really good. He's better than me and you. He's just really good. So the Lord does something that nobody saw coming. What did He do? The Lord parted the Red Sea and Israel crossed on dry ground. What an incredible miracle. Verse 15, the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Move on like where? You know what I mean? Okay. Pharaoh's that way. The Red Sea's this way. Where are we going? But verse 16, raise your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. I'll harden the hearts of the Egyptians. And so God spends this evening just dividing the waters. He also confuses Pharaoh's army so that they remain separated. Look at verse 19. The angel of God who had been traveling in front of Israel's army withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. So these divisions of Israel are already divided into some kind of organizational army. We don't know much about it, but that's the language that's used. And throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to the one side and light to the other side, so neither went near the other all night long. Now, y'all know that the Egyptians are incredibly superstitious people. So when they've got this pillar of cloud standing between them, the last thing they're going to do is take it on. They've already been through so much, so they're going to wait this thing out. But then, verse 21 is when the miracle takes place. And the Lord stretched out his hand over the sea. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, verse 21. And all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. And the waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. What an incredible miracle, right? I know we read it, we know it, but can you imagine how unforgettable this must have been for them? There was literally nowhere to go. There was nothing left, and they were beyond their own resources. And God intervened in a way that they would have never imagined. Turns out he's also really good at doing that kind of thing. He did it for Israel for sure. And then another strange twist. Most chariot drivers avoid mud. That was just kind of the rule in the ancient world. The last thing you want to do with chariots was drive them into the mud. You just wouldn't do that. But these Egyptians saw the Israelites walk across what apparently was dry. So they didn't see that as mud. They perceived it to be dry. And so they're confused, and they take off in the middle of the Red Sea. And then you know the rest of this story. Verse 27 of chapter 14, Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. At daybreak, the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and the horsemen and the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. Another miracle. Not only did the Lord send the plague, not only did the Lord deliver them miraculously, the Lord defeated their enemy right in front of them in an unforgettable way. And so, Israel had been delivered. Verse 29. The Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses his servant. What a remarkable story, y'all. And now this story will captivate the imagination of Jewish theologians from then on. This is their story. Because you and I, as Christians, are the full flower of Judaism. This is our story too. Jesus will take this story and he will use it to demonstrate his messianic role. And so we're connected to this story. It's a powerful one. And it's a miraculous one. And it just reminds us that God is more powerful than we are, that God's going to redeem his people, that God will deliver his people. God is a God of grace. God is powerful. He has no equal. And so even though you and I don't necessarily we weren't involved in the Exodus story, but we've all had seasons in our lives where we've needed God's miraculous intervention. And I believe there are many of you in this room that have been following the Lord a long time. You can give testimony about God's provision for you at just the right moment. He's good at it, and we trust him. It's hard to trust him sometimes. I know that. So I have a hard time trusting sometimes. But I've had to learn. Sometimes when your back's up against a wall, you see God's hand at work. And he doesn't do it every time. Doesn't do it in the way we want him to. He doesn't necessarily do it on our timetable. But in retrospect, I'm amazed at how many times the Lord's intervened in my life and made himself known. Praise his name. Now, Pete, you asked a question last week. How many were there? Well, my answer to that is, how many Israelites were there? It depends. So here's the challenge. If you go back to chapter 12, okay, verse 37, okay, I want you to look at what this text says. The Israelites' journey from Ramesses to Succoth. Here's the NIV's translation. And I'll say this with all due respect. So let me make sure y'all hear that. I'm not a Bible translator, but I do study the text. Bible translators have to, first of all, they have several jobs, and they're divided into categories, okay? Some Bible translators spend most of their career just making sure we have the best text. So they compare ancient texts to make sure we're reading the very best text. It's hard work because these texts are ancient, and we've had to depend on archaeological research to help us understand if we have the best text, okay? So that's one of the things. And then secondly, you have to understand language enough and idioms enough to try to determine, once you have the best text, what does the text actually say? And try to put it in the best way you can into the language into which you are carrying it. So you're taking this from Hebrew to English. How do you do that? How do you communicate it faithfully? It's a challenge. And then sometimes you find words that are very difficult to find one word in your language to capture. Okay? So for example, there's a famous word in Hebrew. It's called hesed. And the word hesed is found numerous times in the Old Testament. And it's translated with the word love. Sometimes it's translated with the word covenant love. Sometimes it's translated with the word mercy. Sometimes it's translated with the word faithfulness. And you and I, all those words are very different in English, but that's one word in Hebrew that, depending on the context, is how we believe the authors meant it to be used. We have one of those words in this text. Okay, it's the word Eleph. And you'll notice the way the NIV translates that word, it translates it with the English word thousand. Do y'all see that? There were 600 Eleph in Hebrew. 1,000. Now, let me just give you a little insight on that word. That word actually, at its core, means ox. So it's pretty obvious how you get from ox to 1,000. I don't think I even have to explain that, right? It's pretty, you've already got that, right? How do you get from ox to 1,000? Well, that is a great question. You know, the Hebrews oftentimes used an ox to protect their cattle. May sound strange, but that is what they would do. So sometimes you would have a handful of cattle in the field, 40, 50 cows. They'd have one ox, and that one ox was kind of the protector, and the cows would follow that ox wherever it went. And so eventually that word morphed into just a herd of cows rather than just referring to the ox. It kind of referred to the whole herd. And then over time it came to represent a number of them. Okay? So it kind of wound its way into numerology. But here's the challenge with that word. In the Bible, in the Old Testament, that word is translated sometimes as ox, sometimes as cattle, sometimes as thousand, sometimes as clan, sometimes as division, sometimes as families. So there were 600 somethings. Okay, 600 somethings. The next little phrase, I put it in there for you in Hebrew, ragli hagaberim. Well, the NIV translates that as men on foot. The problem with that is there are a lot of scholars today who disagree with that translation. In fact, they disagree with both. For example, Doug Stewart, who's a Gordon Conwell professor, brilliant man, brilliant Hebrew scholar. He says you should not translate this as 600,000 men. That is not what this Hebrew means. He says these are 600 leaders or young foot soldiers. Now, y'all can already imagine that's going to change the number of the Israelites. There's a big difference between 600,000 men and 600 young foot soldiers. True? So depending upon how you understand this phrase will tell you how many Israelites you think left in the Exodus. Because you had older soldiers who weren't young foot soldiers, who weren't necessarily chieftains of divisions. Remember how we've read that Israel had an army, that Israel had divisions, that Israel was prepared for battle. Remember, we've been reading all that in this text? Stewart says, well, that's exactly what the text says, and what Moses is telling you is they were divided into 600 divisions. And then you do the research, well, what does that mean? How many divisions are there? How does that connect to something we would understand, like a platoon or a division in our military? There's a lot of military language here. And so by some estimates, around, if you put all those together, they would say there was about 7,200 young, able-bodied men. Include all the older men that were with them, put all their families together, and the approximate number of Israelites will be somewhere around 30,000 to 35,000. If you interpret it the way it's translated in the NIV, then the traditional number would be somewhere between 1.5 to 2 million. The thing that we have to understand at this point is, the bottom line is, because that is difficult to understand exactly how to put it in English, if you ask how many Israelites were there, we don't know. And if you want to argue that there were 1.5 to 2 million and you want to go to the book of Numbers and use the book of Numbers to substantiate that, you're going to run into the same problem in Numbers with Hebrew. There's still going to be some challenges of trying to get that into English. So were there 35,000 or 2 million? I would just have to tell you, I don't know. I don't know that it really matters. Here's what I would say. How many ever there were, God delivered all of them. And He did it with His own power and His own strength in a way that was unforgettable, that they would never, ever be able to walk away from. And it was incredibly miraculous deliverance. So I don't know. I'll be honest with y'all, I probably lean a little more toward the lower number than the upper number. That's changed for me. When I was younger, I leaned more toward the upper number than the lower number. But as I've gotten older and just done a little more research, I lean the other way. But there's nothing to me that violates the text if you pick either one of these. Here's where you start violating the text. You start violating the text when you say things like this. Well, I don't think God actually parted the waters of the Red Sea. What He probably did was harden up the soil around the banks of the Red Sea so that they could kind of not get caught up in the mud. And, that kind of happens in that part of the world. You get a strong east wind, it gets really hot, and the land can dry out. Y'all don't know anything about that in Texas, but there are some places in America where the wind can blow and it doesn't rain for a while, and all of a sudden the land can get parched, Well, you start doing that kind of thing, well, that's where you're starting to violate the text. That's not what the text says. The text says God parted the waters, and there was a column of water on the east and west. In other words, they walked right through the Red Sea. But I don't believe you violate the text when you start trying to figure out the numerology, because it's just complicated in Hebrew. And even how they calculate years is complicated because they use about a lot. You and I are Westerners, we don't like to use about, right? If somebody asks you how much money's in your checking account, you don't like to go, well, about. You want to know, when you call the bank, they go, well, you got about. Well, I don't want to know about. I want to know how much. That's how we are. They weren't that way. Estimates and approximations were used all the time. So if you get caught up in this kind of thing, you can get lost in the real meaning of the story. That's my opinion. So, all right, I'm going to stop right there because we're going to do Passover next week. All right. Thank you for joining us online today, and we'll see you next week.